This is a Viva PR podcast.
We're seeing a lot of people kidding themselves about artificial intelligence, telling themselves and others a lot of lies about their own use. We've got a jet plane or Ferrari in the drive, and all we do is move it backwards and forwards a couple of meters. It's a Swiss Army knife of capability that's quite incredible. Agencies are going to have to differentiate their proposition from content generation. If that's the way you've been describing your service, you're in trouble.
Hello, and welcome to PR in the Real World, the podcast that lifts the lid on what it's really like to work in communications, where budgets are tight and creativity has to work harder. Today's guest is someone who's not just ahead of the curve, he's been shaping it. Ben Verinder is a strategic communications advisor to boards, a founding chartered PR practitioner, and one of the UK's foremost voices on AI in public relations. Alongside Stephen Warrington, he's co-editing an upcoming book on AI for PR, and he's helped everyone from local authorities to global brands adapt to the realities and risks of integrating AI into their comms workflows. But don't worry, this is not a tech talk. Ben brings practical wisdom as well as ethical clarity to the subject. Oh, and he's also a poet, an environmentalist, and someone who's deeply committed to improving the profession. So, if you've been wondering how to make sense of AI in the PR world, or how to get started responsibly, this episode's for you. Let's crack on. So, Ben, tell us a little bit about how you first became interested in AI and in particular AI's role in the PR world.
The short answer is by accident. I was doing some work for NATO, reviewing social and media monitoring tools, and as part of that we'd been looking to see whether there was any machine learning involved in those tools. But also I run a reputation research agency. That's it's one of the things we do, and we have to analyze large volumes of qualitative data, so sort of feedback from senior stakeholders typically for our clients. And for years we'd employed data analysts to code that qualitative data, and I'd been testing AI models and software over the years to see what purported to be AI. Actually, quite a lot of it wasn't, to see whether it could help us with that task, and that's how I got into it originally. But I also bizarrely have a background in ethical philosophy. So my degree was in part of a philosophy and ethics degree. So I'm quite interested in particularly the ethics around AI more generally, but also AI and ethics in relation to data.
So, I mean, you're way ahead of the curve in some senses. I mean, for a lot of us, the AI revolution only occurred around the advent of ChatGPT and other large language models like that. Why do you think it's become a talking point now in the industry?
I mean, I started writing about it in 2017. I think I did the first papers for the CIPR on AI. And fair play to the CIPR, that actually in 2018 up to 2022, they produced quite a few really useful papers, a couple of which I'll mention actually. One's called Humans Still Needed, and the other one's called Humans Needed More Than Ever. And they also produced a super AI and ethics guide. All three papers you can find on the CIPR website. But really, as you sort of suggest, the major increase in intention was in late 22, mid 23, with the introduction of ChatGPT. And essentially, because it was pretty clear to most practitioners fairly rapidly that this was going to have potentially significant benefits on their own personal productivity. So particularly generative AI. So these models are able to generate particularly linguistic content, so content involving language, at great speed, and if prompted correctly, with great benefit to the individual. So it was a launch particularly of that tool, and now we've got lots of other what's called large language models, which I can explain if you like me to, and lots of other tools that are out there to help us.
I think at this stage it'd be worth having a trot through what we mean by large language models and how they work.
So essentially, just to sort of clarify some of these terms, it's really useful that you asked that question, Tony, because it's quite important that we don't presuppose that people have the same understanding of some of these tools, or that people are using any of these tools, because many practitioners are not. So artificial intelligence, essentially, this is intelligence displayed by machines that is in some ways comparable to human intelligence, driven by what's called often associated with what's called machine learning. So this is autonomous learning from a data set as designed by an algorithm, as instructed by some initial programming, but a machine goes off, and very crudely summarized, a machine goes off and it learns independently from a data set. And these large language models, essentially, it's an indicator of the very huge volume of their data sets. So essentially, they are, again, in crude terms, trained on libraries of the internet, what's called common capture, and a variety of other specialist, well, sometimes multiple other specialist databases. So they are informed by huge amounts of language, and they're typically predictive machines. So they are looking to provide essentially an answer based on what they predict to be what we want, the sort of the key answer to the question that we're answering. I won't go into the mass of it, but essentially that's kind of very crudely how they're designed.
And what do you see as the kind of big reputational risks for agencies or clients or for individual practitioners when it comes to the use of AI tools? And then how can those risks be mitigated, do you think?
Well, that's a huge question. So let's unpick a little bit of that and differentiate some of that, so I can answer it. So essentially, we've got two, as public relations practitioners, whether you're in-house or you're in an agency, there's two ways in which artificial intelligence really will affect your role. Firstly, in being an individual practitioner, being professional and capable yourself. So we've got a responsibility to be using artificial intelligence in a way that is responsible, professional, effective, ethical, in order to retain our credibility and to retain the credibility of our service and ourselves as a function going forward in time. And secondly, we have a broader responsibility. And this is because artificial intelligence is changing the way that organizations organize themselves, the way they interact with other people, the way they communicate, and the way really that they interact with the world more generally. And those changes have considerable impacts on reputations and relationships. And that's the purview of public relations. We have a responsibility to assist our clients, or if we're in-house, our organizations, to come to grips with those changes, particularly how they affect the relationships with stakeholders and those who matter most to any organization. So they're the kind of responsibilities. In terms of risks, there are multiple risks from our own use. So that might be what's called slop, so poor quality output because we're not prompting, we're not giving the AI enough instructions. Loads of risks from producing content when we don't understand the biases within a data set. So let's say we're producing images for a campaign. If we don't have scientists, say, for instance, if you go and ask most image generation tools within artificial intelligence, particularly large language models, those embedded within those models, for a picture of a scientist, they will generally produce a picture of a white 30-year-old man standing in a lab coat in a particular type of setting. And actually, that if you ask the AI, the large language model, what biases have affected the production of that image, they'll tell you actually about gender biases, about ethnicity biases, about all sorts of cultural biases within the data set. And there are multiple other risks that we are exposed to as practitioners, but actually there's multiple other risks that our organizations are exposed to as well in the use of artificial intelligence, from again, data on our algorithmic bias, the appropriate use of AI, whether that's acceptable to our stakeholders, the environmental impacts of artificial intelligence and how they might or might not be consistent with our other ecological and environmental commitments as an organization. There's issues of transparency, not just acceptable use, but are we being transparent in the ways that we use artificial intelligence, therefore, and having an honest conversation with our stakeholders and the wider, broader society. We also, as organisations, have responsibilities to further and contribute to the conversation about artificial intelligence across society. There's multiple issues in relation to intellectual property, copyright, human dignity, human rights, that we as organisations and practitioners want to contribute to and should be. There's also issues in relation to misinformation and disinformation, how we deal with information or disinformation that's been generated or that has been as a result of artificial intelligence.
Little wonder then that some people are kind of a bit nervous about entering onto this journey and are a bit wary, shall we say, and rightly so. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see if we can like unpick and what can we do to mitigate some of these issues.
Well, let's be brutal about it. The key fact here is that the majority of people using artificial intelligence, including those in a public relations role, have never been trained on it.
No, true.
And that has major ramifications for particularly the level of output, the quality of output. So we're much more likely to produce slop. I train on artificial intelligence. I help people particularly understand some of these reputational risks. That's my specialism. But obviously also I help develop skills and knowledge in relation to how to use models most effectively. And the vast majority of people I'm training have never are using artificial intelligence, but have never, before I've sort of spoken to them, had any kind of development or training in relation to how to use those models. So what we're getting is poor quality output. Sometimes that means people retreat from artificial intelligence, and we're also getting kind of output and use that isn't also governed by a policy. So the vast majority of us don't have an organisational policy for the use of artificial intelligence. And that's got huge ramifications because we need guidance, all of us, in the agreed approach. Should we be generating images of human beings using artificial intelligence when actually that provokes all sorts of questions in relation to credibility, authenticity, also some legal issues actually. How do we want to approach as an organisation the thorny issue of intellectual property, and what content should we or should we not be uploading to a large language models, for instance? How should we be being made aware of data and algorithmic bias, and how might that affect our use of artificial intelligence? Again, there's multiple questions that need answering, and we need guidance on as users. And unfortunately, the majority of us are using it in the dark. It's the Wild West out there, and there are no sheriffs. Quite a lawless kind of state at the moment.
And it's rare to find individuals like yourself who have got like many years experience in both AI and PR who can understand both our industry and the technology that's out there. Any other AI trainers, a lot of them will only be kind of 1 or 2 steps ahead of where we are.
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not to put myself down. I mean, yes, I've had. I'm not a technical person, for instance. So, sometimes I struggle to use PowerPoint. I use artificial intelligence to train myself on other artificial intelligence. So there's a kind of benefit there. I also do a lot of reading. There are because I teach and because I present on this, I'm sort of forced to do a hell of a lot of reading and read a lot of background papers. And sometimes I get help from artificial intelligence in synthesizing and unpicking some of that, although a lot of it is still done old school. So yeah, but actually, even for people just entering it without any guidance, it doesn't mean you have to start from the beginning. You can, for instance, access best practice guidance from lots of different sources on how to generate an effective AI policy for an agency. There are precedents. Back in 2023, I think June, Agency One, James Crawford runs that one, and launched a public AI policy for that agency, which is still worth looking at even after 2 years. It's a really good policy, and there are lots of other agency policies out there. So if you're an agency and you haven't got a policy, don't start from scratch. There are lots of others that you can look at that are in the public domain. If you're in-house, There are multiple others, and you can ask again large language models to help you in this endeavor, but you will want to moderate and adjust those based on the realities of your organization. And there will be some questions around what you particularly need as an agency and an in-house that are particular to your organization and your sector. The other thing to mention before I forget is you can also read a book on it, which is I'm editing at the moment. I'm co-editing with the wonderful Stephen Waddington. So Stephen and I are currently in the throes of collecting our chapters from our various contributors, and there are chapters in there on developing and socializing a policy and implementing artificial intelligence from an agency point of view and from an in-house point of view. So that'll be out in early 2026. So do look out for that, because that will have lots and lots of detail to help you develop policies or to refine your policy if you've already written one.
When it comes to a policy, and given what you already know, and you've pointed us in the direction of a couple of good examples, but what are the kind of like baseline things that you should, if we're doing a checklist of with my agency training wheels on, what are must-haves that you've seen that are really good practice?
Well, top of my list would always be a clear statement of how you are and how you are not using artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Now, this doesn't mean that you have to mark every part of your content with a sort of nutrition label of the extent to which it's been generated by a human and the extent to which it's been generated by artificial intelligence, because actually, from the point of view of an agency, that's not practical, it's too granular. But what you will want to do is have a clear statement of where you do and where you don't use artificial intelligence, because for lots of different reasons. One of those is intellectual property. So in this jurisdiction in the UK and across the world, and most others, content that is generated by artificial intelligence is not afforded intellectual property right. Which means that if you're an agency and you are developing content and you're actually doing so exclusively with artificial intelligence, let's say a new logo or a strapline for a client, and then you're signing that over to a client and you're the typical contract and you're assigning the intellectual property rights to the client, that's not worth the paper that's written on, because you can't assign those rights because it doesn't have any if you've used artificial intelligence to generate it. However, if you're very clear about where you're using humans, the converse is possible, that you'll be asserting your intellectual rights to particular parts of content, because we are soon going to be getting to a point where clients and general publics expect content, or certain types of content in particular, to be generated by artificial intelligence. We might also find that we as an agency or in-house, that we really want to be very clear where we've put a human premium on content, where we've reserving things for human generation, because actually that might be a quality mark of sorts in the future. And there's lots of other reasons why we want to be very clear with to our clients and more generally where we are and we're not. So that would be definitely top of my list of your policy, of kind of where you are and where you're not. But other things to consider is going to be, essentially, the kind of data you put into it, how you're going to guard against misinformation, how you're going to update your policy, when you're going to train people on your policy, who does it apply to, issues such as, whether you are mitigating any environmental impacts through the use of AI, whether you're using local AI, which has, so there are really quite sophisticated data analysis models that you can upload to a single computer, where you're not using the internet, and therefore you've got lower issues in terms of energy use. There are all sorts of these kind of questions, and then questions in relation to how you're going to deal with, for instance, retaining, training your AI and updating it if you're using it. So that multiple difference. But I think a clear statement of where and how you're using it is top of the list probably for any agency.
That's a really interesting jumping off point. I think if we move it ahead, one of the things you mentioned in terms of the risk things is the rise of slop. How do we avoid slop, and how do we, that repetitive AI content that we see all over like LinkedIn and so on? What can we do?
It's a good point to say that overarching sort of advice I would give to anybody listening to this is ensuring at all points there's a human in the loop.
Right.
And why? Many different reasons. Partly because to retain your human agency, partly to retain your organizational or agency integrity over decision making, that you're not giving away decision making, giving away decisions that actually you should have agency over. But also one of the reasons is also to retain editorial quality over the content that you're generating. And if you're producing content that isn't effective as communications content, then there's something wrong there. So again, what we're seeing is, individuals or agencies or in-house teams or whoever, ceding agency to a large language model which is inappropriate, because if you're producing communications content that's poor quality, then it's not going to communicate in the way you want it to.
Yeah.
So there's that, but there's also training about how to generate effective prompts and instructions for your large language models, how to provide samples so it knows what good and poor looks like. There's a lot of really poor discussion, like say for instance on LinkedIn about how you can spot and how you can't spot LLM or AI generated content, and actually a lot of it is very is just mistaken about the nature of these things, because actually really effective producers you can't tell whatsoever. The detection rate, for instance, of AI detection software is very poor. There's huge amounts of false positives. And it's a very dodgy game actually to try and identify AI generated, but where it's and generated content. But however, where it's really obvious something's gone wrong, and generally what's gone wrong is that people are using it without any training and without really thought about, is this as appropriate content to be using AI to generate?
I mean, anybody listening to us so far will be thinking, perhaps who uninitiated might be thinking, blimey, I don't think I'll get involved in this. But generally speaking, are you an advocate for agencies and individuals and companies using AI if they know what they're doing?
I am, partly because it's inevitable.
Yeah.
The productivity benefits, particularly at the moment to individual productivity, are quite incredible. So our capacity to repurpose content, to generate content, for ideation, for data analysis, for horizon scanning, for strategic development, for stakeholder mapping, for risk assessment, for issues management. I use artificial intelligence in all these ways and many more, and its capabilities and capacities are astounding. If we stop developing large language models now, it would take us over 10 years just to get to grips with its capabilities and capacities. And that's not a quote from me, that's from a leading commentator called Ethan Mollick, who's far more wise and more and a brilliant person. That's Mollick. I would recommend anybody who's listening to this follow him. Who's an incredibly erudite but also straightforward commentator on artificial intelligence. So yeah, and not only that, I mean, beyond public relations, we've got AI being used for scientific breakthroughs on a daily basis, and detection of cancers in a way we'd never have thought, in the development of drugs, in architecture, in scientific development more broadly, in materials construction. I could go on. It's revolutionizing many areas of life in very positive ways, but it also introduces considerable risk, particularly in the ways that we communicate with each other.
Yeah. I think when we were, before the red light came on, you were saying one of the positives for our PR agencies is that we are good at communicating, and we should be good at communicating how we want the AI tool to respond to us, and to build up the correct prompts or
and this is a kind of thesis of mine. This is I will put my name to this one in the sense that prompt engineering is the phrase that's used to describe the instructions, the development of effective instructions for most large language models, for instance. I think it's actually quite a misleading term, because really it's prompt writing. It's typically a series of instructions, which we give, written instructions, which we give these large language models about what we want to do. And it often involves effective prompt writing, involves giving samples and examples, and sometimes giving examples of exactly what you don't want it to do, so it understands what poor quality work looks like. And although prompt writing over time will become less important because reasoning models and what's called agentic AI will become more intuitive about what individual users, again, there's lots of caveats to this, want. In the short to medium term, I think prompts will continue to be very important pieces of work. And guess who's good at writing effective instructions particularly to templates and really giving enough detail with really precise, whatever language they're using, with precise language? Us, public relations practitioners. So what I'm finding in my client base, where I'm training a PR team or a comms team on artificial intelligence, they often go on to be early adopters or ambassadors or lead users of AI within a workplace. And there's a real opportunity for public relations, I see in this, as well as an opportunity in relation to reputation management more broadly, and the impact of AI on operations and interaction. So actually, I think, interestingly enough, artificial intelligence presents some significant opportunities for the public relations function, agency and in-house.
Before you came on as a guest, we put out to some of our contacts in-house and client base. We told them that Ben was coming on the show, and what questions would you like to ask Ben? So here's a couple of them, and you've touched on one of them. One was around environmental concerns and people wanting to understand. They've heard some of the kind of scare stories about the amount of energy that's burned because of every time you ask ChatGPT to do something. But what's the true picture, and how can clients and agencies offset that problem?
I think if you're scratching your head about this, there's good reason to, because the picture is less than clear. So there's an off-cited, I think it's a Gartner paper, I'm not entirely sure it comes from, which there's an off-cited stat about the fact that the typical prompt to that kind of engagement with a large language model uses up 10 times more energy than the use of a search engine. It's nothing like as simple as that. And the reason I'm particularly interested in this is I'm an environmental poet. So I'm actually the Environmental Poet of the Year. And I have wrestled with the energy use question in relation to artificial intelligence. And sometimes I get to a point when I find information, it's sometimes get to a point where I'm thinking, okay, do I just pull out of this completely? Hitherto, there's not enough evidence to persuade me that I shouldn't. Let me explain why. The majority of energy use of a large language model, for instance, so when we're talking about ChatGPT here, just to be clear to everybody, Anthropic from Claude, or Gemini from Google, Llama from Facebook, a variety of others that you'll know of, Copilot from Microsoft. The majority of energy in relation to the activity of that large language model is in the training. Okay, so and therefore, when you are interacting with it, it's already trained itself. So to sort of think about search being in that comparison doesn't really work that well. We've also have to, I'm afraid, face up to the fact that search is completely changing as well, and we're likely to see major issues with the change in search and how we engage in search. And already you're seeing in Google actually an AI generated response above the standard search kind of responses, search results. So that muddies the water in relation to this. It's not that's search, that's AI superseding search. Also, there's some fantastic analysis done by a man called Simon Willison, looking at energy use based on the cost to us as the users. Because the problem with AI companies is they are very secretive about pretty much everything that they do to some extent. And one of the things they're secretive about is the energy that they use. Now that you might say, well, is that because it's a bad story? Well, they're pretty much secretive about most things, actually, for all sorts of different reasons. So we don't really know how much energy they use. But if we think about the cost to us of a user, and these are models that have been around since 23, Simon's analysis sort of demonstrates fairly clearly that the computational efficiency of these models is increasing at such a rate that effectively most of them, with some quite important exceptions, are, based on that evidence, using very little energy. The difference is where we use deep reasoning models or agentic AI, they have different levels of energy use. Then let me make it even more complex. We can now introduce models onto a laptop or a PC at home that do all sorts of specialist jobs. And for agencies and in-house teams, you'll soon, I think, your IT teams you're going to have some of these discussions, partly because it helps with data security as well. Things aren't attached to the internet. So that's going to massively reduce the energy use. However, we've got one of the bigger issues is possibly the cooling of data centers. So where all of this processing goes on. So actually, the water requirement of artificial intelligence more broadly is probably a bigger concern. However, last week I met somebody who is an expert in data center design, and they told me that quite a lot of the public information in relation to data centers is out of date and inaccurate, and many of them are not using water for cooling. So actually, what this needs probably is some really concrete studies to look at the overview. Now, I'm actually going to do some work on this as a question because I'm incredibly interested in it for obvious reasons. The jury's out. And anybody who says it isn't right now is over certain, I think, because the evidence base is so fractured and there's so many questions over it. But I mean, if you're an organization you need to keep a watching brief on this, really do, and particularly be thinking about what models two questions to think about. What models can we use locally to reduce our energy usage? And secondly, where might we want to differentiate between general AI use and some specialist stuff like deep research, which is more energy intensive? And I apologize for the very detailed response, but that's because it's complicated. Like, unfortunately, for most of this stuff, it's not as simple as, it's not black and white, it's grey.
It's a fascinating response, and it is really interesting, and it's great to get your take on it, because few of us have delved as deeply. We just get the snippet of, oh, it's bad for you, so it's bad for the planet.
Yeah, and I'm going to do more work on this because it's a really good question. Whoever asked it's a great question, and frankly, we don't know.
Well, here's another one for you then. How will AI change the client agency dynamic? With clients coming around saying, well, I can produce X in 3 seconds now, so why do I need you guys?
Predicting the future when it comes to artificial intelligence is a bit of a fool's errand, and I'm sometimes guilty of it. And typically I turn out to look like a fool. So, I'm often wrong. However, I don't need to predict the future because I know it's already happening. I've been working with some international agencies, for instance, who have been affected by their client base doing just that. So bringing work in-house, training large language models on material and generating content. And then that's had an impact on either the relationship, what they're wanting from the agency, or sometimes actually they've just decided to part ways with their agency. Agencies are going to have to, in short order, if they haven't already done it, number one, differentiate their proposition from content generation. So if that's what you're selling, you're in trouble. If you're a media relations agency, an agency that's heavy on media relations, you're not selling content generation. And if that's the way you've been describing your service, you're in trouble. What you're selling is relationships with journalists. You're selling expert content generation that is expert because it's nuanced by humans. You're selling all sorts of elements of judgment about placement in a campaign, for instance, would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, for an artificial intelligence large language model to replicate. And secondly, if you're selling time, then you're in trouble. If you're still selling on an hourly billing rate, then that really forces the client in some ways to think about you from an hourly point of view. So they're thinking about you from a time point of view rather than an impact point of view, and that's problematic. And that puts it makes it easier for them to make the mistake to judge you just on content generation against time, where actually your offer is something much more interesting, important, and nuanced. So really, those two things about how you're describing your offer, how you've been describing your offer, and how you're billing on your offer. And we've seen this already. We're seeing these considerable changes in the agency-client relationship. But the third thing to say is, you're going to want to be forward with your clients about how you're using artificial intelligence, and on the front foot about that, because that, again, as I've hinted earlier on, that has major implications for the legal basis of the contracts with which you're engaging with them, for instance. And also, in short order, they'll be expecting you to be using artificial intelligence, and there'll be positives and negatives about that. And if you want to be is purposeful, and you want to have, you want to be staking your claim to whichever way you want to do it. If you're using lots of AI, great. If you want to be AI leading, great. But if you're reserving the human qualities and human output, you need to be intentional about that. It's all about intentionality.
And being clear and transparent about what it is you're doing, and on either end of that spectrum.
We're public relations practitioners. We know that transparency is beneficial to relationships, and lack of transparency is problematic. So we really want to be transparent with our client base and make sure that they understand. And there'll be an education piece happening here. It's not as if clients are any more aware of or expert in artificial intelligence than their agencies. They're not. What's interesting is we've seen in research, such as the state of the profession studies, of which I'm the author, we're seeing a lot of people kidding themselves about artificial intelligence. So telling themselves and others quite a lot of lies about their own use and their own expectations. So for instance, when we ask in-house practitioners that use an agency whether they've asked the agency about their AI policy, whether they've asked for an AI policy, they massively overestimate the fact that whether they have or not. Because if we ask the same question to our agencies and say, have you been asked about an AI policy, the rate is statistically far lower. So what we've got is this big mismatch between in-house people saying they have. What they mean is, I'd like to, but I've not asked yet.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of this actually. And another health warning on AI. You'll see a lot of stuff in the public domain about who's using and who isn't, and data around this. Quite a few of those studies are problematic because I know from my own research that in different circumstances we either overestimate or underestimate AI use. We typically underestimate it or underreport it when we're talking to our employers or our clients, and we overreport it when we're doing things like anonymous surveys, because it's a sort of wishful thinking. We sort of say to survey people like me, oh yeah, I'm using it with regularity at work, when actually, when we unpick some of this, you're not.
That is really fascinating that we're selective on our responses there. Another question that came through was, what do you think is the best AI-driven tool stack for an agency right now? So what are your go-tos that you could share?
Ethan Mollick, who I mentioned earlier on, often talks about the fact that we've got a jet plane or Ferrari in the drive, and all we do is move it backwards and forwards a couple of meters. We've got this incredibly sophisticated large language models, and crudely put, and this is a real crude summary, Tony, they can do pretty much everything that you might want them to do, particularly now they've got inbuilt relatively high quality image generation tools. They've got a deep research, so these kind of a capacity to go off and answer quite a complex question using researching across the internet. They've got agentic quality, so they can do jobs while you go off and have a cup of tea. They've got also they've got reasoning elements, so data analysis, sophisticated data analysis capabilities. So sat within ChatGPT, 3.0, all the different models, is a sort of Swiss Army knife of capability that's quite incredible. So just using one of these tools well is revolutionary, and that could be Gemini if you're using Google Suite. It could be Anthropic, so Claude from Anthropic, could be even, although There are more issues with Copilot because it has a sort of smaller context window, so it's less able to answer sophisticated, longer queries. But generally, all of these, and again, I'm summarizing crudely, all of these models can pretty much smash it out of the park with whatever you want to do. But there are other elements of artificial intelligence that communications and marketing teams will be using, particularly where the AI is built into the proprietary software. So we're now seeing within Adobe Suite considerable amount of artificial intelligence. We're seeing within Canva AI element that's very helpful. And this is really happening across, we're seeing this in, again, some of the Microsoft products such as PowerPoint, particularly if you're using the online version, etc. So we've got AI dotted all over the place in Microsoft Editor, in Gmail. We are using those incrementally, whether we think we are or not. We're all using some element of artificial intelligence in our daily lives.
You've mentioned Ethan Mollick a couple of times, and we're big fans of his book here, and his Substack is one that I actually follow. But who else should we be listening to and following? And are there any other Ethan Mollicks out there, other than yourself, obviously, Ben?
Well, I mean, there's lots of brilliant people. The other person that always comes to mind when this question is asked is Christopher Penn. So Christopher Penn produces a newsletter as well. So I think Ethan's is called One Useful Thing, and can't remember Chris's one, but basically he's called his overarching sort of product base called Trust Insights. So if you'll find him there. And Chris is interesting because he's a former marketing PR person that's now specializing in advising on artificial intelligence. And Chris is really good for devising effective prompt frameworks. In particular, I've found his work really useful for that. Jenny Nicholson, she's a US-based AI developer who's really good on the realities of adoption of AI within any given team. She's not a PR communications professional, I don't think, but again, she's got some really straightforward frameworks for AI adoption. Other people who I read, obviously Andrew Bruce Smith, who's a colleague of mine who teaches through the CIPR, who's super knowledgeable about the technological landscape, extremely knowledgeable. Some of the more strategic questions, or some other strategic questions, Stephen Waddington as well, so Stephen and I. But again, you might want to go and have a look at particular pieces of work by people. So one of the contributors to our book is Amy Mollett, and Amy is a head of social media at Cambridge University, and they produced a fantastic AI policy back in 2023, which I talk about quite a lot. And Amy's writing a book about policies and socializing policies, sorry, a chapter for our book on policies and socializing policies. And so again, there's lots of other great content out there. But if in doubt, ask an AI, and they'll give you all sorts of recommendations for people to follow. I'm reading a book by a human rights lawyer called Susan Allegro, which is called Human Rights, Robot Wrongs, I think, or the other way around, Robot Wrongs, Human Rights, I think, which is about the broader ethical questions in relation to artificial intelligence and the impact on our society. But other people I can mention include Anne Gregory, again, Professor Anne Gregory, who is writing a lot about that question about the role of public relations in informing the social and civic debate in relation to artificial intelligence adoption. She's writing with a colleague a fantastic chapter for us on that topic for the book.
Interesting. I mean, let's do a little bit deeper dive in and let you plug the book a little bit more, because I'm really excited about it. Tell us the genesis of how that got started and what you hope to achieve with the book.
Well, essentially, it's two things really. Stephen and I had been in discussions for a very long time, actually, about the possibility of a book, but it always felt until recently that the landscape was changing at such pace that by the time we'd written a sentence, it'd be out of date.
Yeah.
However, a few months ago, I think we got to a point, both of us, where we could see trends across the piece, and we could identify things that were staying, that continued to be true independent of changes of the landscape, such as best practice in policy generation and socialization, as Amy's contribution, or how you might introduce the best strategies for introducing AI into an agency, approaches for introducing AI into an in-house team specifically, the reputational risks, which is my specialism, the reputational risks of AI and how they might be mitigated. the social and political pressures of AI, the landscape as it's developed so far, and the tools that we're using, they're not changing hugely, and the types of tools we might use in the future. So we kind of came up with a sort of list of maybe about 15, 16 chapters based on these kind of ideas, and we went out and found the best people to write those that we knew of, and asked them if they'd like to get involved in the project. So we've got, I think, I can't remember, I think 12, 13 contributors alongside all experts in their field, alongside Stephen and I, and we're writing a few chapters, but they're all contributing chapters. So we're going to be looking through the drafts, and then we've got sort of late production coming into sort of second draft production in the summer, and then as usual we'll be submitting to the Publishers Kogan page, and that should be ready in early 2026.
I'm really looking forward to it. We'll no doubt get you and Stephen back on before or around that, just to kind of tell the world, help you tell the world that it exists. And
great, yeah, please.
Yeah. Tell us about the kind of, you mentioned before that you've not got a crystal ball and you don't want to make crazy predictions about the future, but where do you see AI in PR heading over the next couple of years? How do you see the landscape maturing?
I think we're going to get, I hope, if I was going to be optimistic, I think we'd see an increase in proficiency through training, an adoption of policies as standard. I think we're likely to see, and again, some of this thinking is informed by experts like Christopher Penn, who writes quite a lot on his predictions for the next 12 to 24 months. We're going to see what Chris has calls beyond content. So we're likely to see the adoption of artificial intelligence, particularly large language models, for activities beyond content generation. So particularly for data analysis, the capabilities of which are quite mind-boggling. And we're likely to see it for the adoption for things like strategic planning more broadly. I think we're likely to see, particularly in the next 2 years, a longer time span, this movement towards very, not aggressive, but very clear statements of where content is human generated, sort of almost like some agencies, I think, and I saw an article on the BBC about this recently, have an agency. Some agencies will aggressively, quite for good reason, set out that they're not adopting artificial intelligence because actually they see benefits in retaining a purely human output.
Yeah.
I think we're likely to see, lots of conversations around the ethics. When I train, pretty much most of the really meaty conversations are all around the ethical decisions that we need to make as individuals, organisations, and then more broadly. Hopefully, we'll see governments catch up with reality, because at the moment we've got lots of regulatory questions that are not answered by law, particularly around copyright, but also about algorithmic decision making in our everyday lives. If you're getting insurance, if you are using a health service, if you're serviced by a council, if you're having your tax calculated or reviewed, if you are multiple times in your day, you will be subject to algorithmic decision making, but you won't know it. And therefore, we need a lot of transparency around that. There's often a leap to identify a technological solution when actually we might want to retain human influence and human sort of interference in the best way in all sorts of activities. So we're going to be seeing a lot of discussions in the public domain about that. We're also likely to see a considerable increase in misinformation and disinformation in the public domain generated by artificial intelligence, I'm afraid. And the bad news for everybody listening to this is the research is really clear on this. Your clients and if you're in-house, your leadership team, they expect you as a communication team or an agency to be right at the front of guarding and helping guard against misinformation and disinformation. Now, actually, it's a much more complex and challenging task than just for communicators. It's actually a social problem to do with data hygiene, media literacy, all sorts of things, inoculation against all sorts of different challenges, But from an organizational point of view, there's lots of things that we can do to support our organizations if they're at risk of or affected by misinformation, things like cyber attacks, for instance, as communicators. So we need to be particularly expert at that, because that's a major risk for all of us.
Well, finally, I've got one question. As the MD and founder of a smallish agency like Viva, just beginning in the kind of AI infancy journey, what are the kind of 3 practical steps that you'd recommend us to get started responsibly and effectively?
I have a model called the Bridges model, which I've devised, which sort of speaks to the name of my business, which is Chalk Stream. I also write about rivers, so I do lots of things with water. But essentially, and that model has various elements as indicated by the acronym. But the B stands for briefing, which is having a discussion about internally, fairly sharpish, about how you might and might not want to use artificial intelligence, and having a discussion with leadership and with your clients about their expectation, etc. So some level of boundary spanning internally and externally. So you've got an understanding of where the wind blows. There was an agency recently that was working on behalf of a local authority, and they used artificial intelligence to generate some collateral for a campaign on behalf of an art gallery / museum. And there's considerable backlash from the stakeholders of that museum, many of whom are creatives, who feel, for lots of good reasons, quite threatened by the advent of artificial intelligence. And that is a demonstration that some of those early discussions that agency might have had didn't happen. And it's kind of making sure that you're understanding the landscape in terms of the tools and experimenting with these, but really making sure that you are not you're playing around but not generating content that you're going to use. So Ethan again talks about the 10-hour rule, where we really need to have the freedom, and Jenny writes about this quite a lot. We need to have the freedom in a sandbox environment to play around with some of these tools to see what they can do, particularly for us as individuals and individual practitioners, but also collectively, without ever using the output. So there's no pressure on us and there's no impact on our agency. So you get experiment, muck about, but in a really safe, contained environment. That's really so those initial conversations, the mucking about, and then it's really important that if we move on and we do adopt some tools, that we do that in a quite a measured and limited way. And what I mean by that is, doing just 2 or 3 things collectively. That might be press release generation. It might be ideation for campaigns. It might be content repurposing from, from a newsletter into social content. But we're really limiting our use as a team or an agency so that we can, after say 2 or 3 weeks, come back together and evaluate the efficiencies that have been involved, and the problems and the challenges and the benefits, and we can have an informed discussion about that. If you adopt stuff at too quick a pace, all at one go, as you'll know, the challenge is that you're going to find it difficult to evaluate the positives and negatives of that adoption. So we have to be quite strategic about it. There are lots of other things you need to do in the agency, but those are the 3 things I'd say you're definitely top of your list of things to do. Those initial conversations with clients and internally, the experimentation, and then the kind of identification of some core activities that you can use as a starter for 10.
It's a really exciting precipice, I think we're on at the minute. We're diving into the deep end, whether we like it or not. But Ben, it's been fantastic. We could chat all day. I mean, we could get into poetry and dig a little bit. Where can people find your poetry, by the way? That'd be interesting.
Just online, if you Google it. So it's my poetry. And if you tried to ask a large language model to write in the style of Ben Verinder, it wouldn't do a very good job, because most of my stuff is not available in the internet, so it hasn't been ripped off or stolen by pirate libraries that train LLMs. You can just find it online. So I've got three pamphlets published by different organizations, but the latest is called How to Save a River, unsurprisingly, and it's the pamphlet that won me the Michael Marks Environmental Poet of the Year prize, and you can buy that from the Wordsworth Trust at Grasmere or from the British Library.
Excellent. Well, I'll be searching that out. And thank you so much for your time, Ben. It's been superb, and well worth a listen for anybody out there. Cheers again.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to PR in the Real World. If you've enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you could subscribe to the podcast and leave us a quick review. Your support really helps spread the word and reach more marketing and PR professionals just like you. And don't forget to share this podcast with your colleagues or anyone who'd benefit from the insights we share. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time for more tips, strategies and real world stories from the PR frontlines.